Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the course Environmental Impact Assessment. In the previous lectures, we saw origin of EIA in US and its worldwide development. So today we will be covering, we'll be looking at what's the current state of EIA in India and we'll map it at the global context. Further, we'll look at the initial environmental movement in India so that we understand what is our perspective, what challenges we have, and how far we have moved on this line. Further, we'll also side by side also look at the evolution of EIA in India. So the expected learning outcomes, what we see is like you should be able to contextualize EIA in India on the global context. You should be able to describe the initial environmental movement in the country. Further, you should be able to describe the evolution of EIA in Indian context. So let us first locate India with respect to EIA with the developed countries as well as developing countries, and this particular session is taken from UN Training Manual. So looking at comparing developed countries, developing countries and India, we see with respect to EIA legislation, we see in the developed countries, EIA legislation is very well framed. For example, we can see it in Canada. It has Canada Environmental Assessment Act regulates EIA, as well as you see the EU countries are also guided by directive on EIA. So their legislations are very well framed as they have started at the initial level. Whereas in the developing countries, you see that there's most often in many of the countries, there's lack of formal EIA legislation. For instance, EIA is not mandatory in many of the African countries. While in India, you will see that there's a formal legislation for EIA. It has been enacted by making an amendment in the Environmental Protection Act of 1986. The prevalent act is EIA Notification 2006, and right now we have a draft which is 2020, which is under consideration. So moving on to the other aspect, when we look at EIA regarding public and government involvement, we see that in the developed countries, as per this review, what we see is there is active involvement of all participants in the process of public involvement, including like you see competent authority, all the stakeholders are involved, the government agencies are involved, and even the affected people are involved at a very early stage of the EIA. So process we see is also more robust and gives a fair idea of the issues which are there from the very beginning of the inception of the project. And likewise, when we talk about the developing countries, there's limited involvement of the public and the government agencies in the initial phases, though there is some involvement at the later stage. So because of this, it often results in poor representation of the issues and impacts in report, and which adversely negatively affects the quality of the report. So if people are not involved, government is also, their engagement is less and lesser in the initial period, then there's a lot of things which are left out, and it eventually impacts the quality of the report. Whereas when we see in India, we have public and government agencies involvement, but what is being reviewed is that there's limited involvement at the initial level of the process, so which also leads to a lot of confusion or complex situation at the later stage. So, looking at the another aspect, that is integrated approach to EIA. So, while we see how integrated our approach is in concern with EIA, we see that all aspects, including social and health, are taken into account. While in the developing countries, it's mostly focuses on the geophysical aspects, and other social and health aspects are not well considered. As well, when we look at India, we see that we have expanded a lot in many domains, as socioeconomic impact assessments and other things, but still there are limitations to what we have expanded to, like for example, landscape and visual impacts have been not yet considered in the process. Further, we see that when we look at the alternatives in EIA, how alternatives are really considered in EIA process. When we say alternatives, we mean like how many options, how many proposals we are really looking into in terms of the design alternatives, in terms of location alternatives. So when we take look at EIA process from that perspective, we see that in the developed countries, there's proper consideration and all the alternatives are evaluated. Further, we see in the developing countries, it's more or less absent, and our case is also not that developed in terms of evaluating the alternatives. So, looking at the another aspects of EIA, looking at the process and especially the screening part of the process. So we see that in developed countries, it's very well defined. For instance, in EU countries, competent authorities decide whether EIA is required after seeking advice from the developers, NGOs, and statutory consultants. And in Japan, we see that the screening decision is made by the authorizing agency with respect to the certain criteria which are available to them, as same applies with Canada as well, where federal authority determines whether an environmental assessment is required or not. And in case of developing countries, when they do what process they really adopt is like here's the screening practice is said to be considerably weak. In most cases, there is a list of activities that require EIA. And also in that list, also many a times, the threshold limit values are not really specified. Whereas when we look at India, we also do it by screening is done by the list. And our list has certain threshold value in terms of the size, nature of the project. So on that basis, the screening is done. So the advantage of this, though we do it by this list method, it saves considerable amount of time, and it also avoids a lot of litigation which might come upon. So there are double advantage of going by list. It gives clarity, it saves time, and because it's clear, it avoids a lot of litigation which might arrive because of interpretation or the decisions which is made by the committee. So, looking at the other part of the process, the next, if you can recollect, we studied about the various stages of the process. So that was first one was of the screening, and if we look at the scoping process, so in scoping process, what usually when we look towards the developed countries, there's like comprehensive process. It is said to involve a lot of consultants, and it engages well with the stakeholders in and it's the countries like US, Netherlands, Canada, and Europe. The involvement of public and their concerns are addressed in the scoping exercise. So at the very beginning, like we said, public participation is addressed, the public is involved at the very beginning of it. So here you see that at the scoping level also the public consultation takes place. And